to us at TD, we spend a lot of time talking about the Montney. Today I wanted to make it very specific about cube development in the Montney. And to do so, we've got a 45-minute panel. We've got 5 presenters, a really good lineup. I'll introduce them in a second here. We'll go straight to Q&A, so there won't be any formal presentations. Tons of questions that I have to ask. If there are any questions for those that are on the line, please make sure to type them into the Ask a Question button on the website, and I'll make sure to have everything addressed. So I won't waste too much more time. I'll introduce our 5 speakers today. Representing Advantage, we've got Mike Belenky. He's the President and COO. For those that don't know, Advantage is a Alberta-focused Montney producer, 45,000 BOEs a day approximately. Core areas at Glacier and other more liquids-focused areas in Alberta, Progress, Valhalla, Wembley. Next, we've got Birchcliff, and by the way, I'm just going in alphabetical order here. Jeff Tonkin, President and CEO. Birchcliff is an 80,000 barrel a day company, also 100% Alberta-focused. Core areas are Pouce Coupé and Gordondale. Third, we've got Dave Wilson. He is the President and CEO of Kelt Exploration. Kelt's about 30,000 BOEs, about half oil and NGLs. They've got about 500,000 acres across in the Montney across BC and Alberta. The key developments here are at Inga and Fireweed, that's in BC, and then Progress and Montney in Alberta. Over to New Vista, we've got Jonathan Wright, President and CEO. New Vista, Alberta-focused Montney producer, about 60,000 BOEs a day. Most of their prospects are in the Wapiti area of Alberta, with a new core area that they're developing at Pipestone. And then finally, we've got Pat Ward, President and CEO of Painted Pony. Painted Pony is a 50,000 BOE producer in Northeast BC, with the key areas Blair, Diber, and Townsend. So with all that behind us, we'll jump straight into Q&A. Birchcliff, Jeff, this is for you. I'll start with you here. Clearly, Birchcliff is one of the largest Montney producer on our panel from a production and cash flow perspective. I think over 300 horizontals drilled to date. But really, you know, in the theme of talking about cube development in the Montney, it's really only 2020 that Birchcliff shifted to a cube-style development program with a 14-well cube at Pouce Coupé and a 10-well cube at Gordondale. So I guess the question to you, Jeff, is can you walk us through the logic as to, you know, how Birchcliff, you know, has evolved and determined that 2020 is the year to pursue the cube?
Well, first of all, JJ, thanks for having me. I appreciate it very much, and thanks for TD for organizing this. I think this is probably the first Tuesday afternoon of Stampede I've ever been in my office, so it's a good opportunity for us to talk to you about cube development. So as you said, we just finished our first 14-well pad at Pouce Coupé. So for listeners to understand that, that's a $70 million investment all in one pad. And we drilled all 14 wells and then completed them all at the same time. So we're not talking about drilling parts of sections and going back and then going back. We're talking about drilling all 14 wells at once. We drilled 5 wells in the Montney C, 4 wells in the Montney D1, and 5 wells in the Montney D2. And the reason we did it, I think, is part of a process where we did a science and technology pad 2 years ago that we invested about $30 million in. It gave us critical insights into reservoir management and then accelerated field development. So when you take those two concepts under the reservoir behavior, we did a number of tests that gave us information about fracture initiation and propagation, interwell fracture communication, well productivity by clusters, role of natural fractures on production, and optimal well spacing by zone and between zones, and then added that a different concept, which is the field development, which taught us about well landing depths, well spacing laterally and vertically, cluster spacing and stage length, impact of the diversion of improving distribution efficiencies, stage locations, the validations by using tracers to understand where our production was coming from, and then all of that was used to maximize return on investment. And when you look at that, really what you want to do is drill those wells spaced properly so you can reduce all of your costs. And when you really cut through it all, it's about getting the most production from those wells with the least amount of investment to drill those wells, and then get that production on into our infrastructure system, which could handle that new production, which is now just coming on, and ensuring by having the availability of large undrilled tracts of land, we could minimize the communication with current wells that are producing, i.e. frac communication. So by having large undeveloped tracts of land, we could drill large cube drilling development plan where we didn't knock out our production.
So the key catalyst was having that science technology pad, which provided you a lot of data and insights into determining that cube development is the right way to go. But I guess do you have enough results today from that pad to determine any changes you would make, or how successful is it? Like, how early is it to talk about the results from that pad?
It's too early. We just completed the fracking of those wells. So I do know one thing. We drilled the wells. We used 2 rigs. So we are under budget with respect to the amount of time it took us to drill the wells. And then we are under budget again for the amount of time it took us to frack those wells. And now the question is, what type of productivity are we going to get from those wells? And we will soon be turning those on, and we'll see what those results are. And we'll have some initial thoughts on that in our Q2 press release on August the 12th.
Great. Dave, with Kelt being one of the smaller producers on the panel, and historically the Kelt exploration business model has been, more focused on exploration rather than development. As everybody knows, or for those that don't know on the line, Kelt did commence a 24-well pad at Inga in BC in kind of 6-well increments. Their first ever multi-well pad, or cube, excuse me, is the better word there. Can you give us a sense of, how you thought about that strategic shift from exploration to development, 1, and then 2, similar to my question to Jeff, how have the results been, and what would you do differently going forward?
Yeah, thanks, JJ. With this switch to development, realistically, we plan to do that on all our different areas, but each area was at a different stage. So, Inga Fireweed was ahead of Wembley, ahead of Oak. We've done some multi-well drilling there, multi-pad well pad drilling in Puskapay, but like you say, this is the first time that we've actually done it in a cube style. So that's really the reason why we jumped to a development stage in Inga Fireweed, was just because it was to that stage in its cycle. But very similar points to what Jeff said. We wanted to determine the efficiencies you could get with drilling from a big pad and drilling that many wells at once, and along with the completions, and wanted to try to learn as much as we could. And what we did was actually, and that's why we actually split it up into 6 wells at a time. Definitely some more efficiencies to be had by going, say, 12 and 12, which probably you would do the next time. But what we were trying to do there is try to learn as we went. So we're trying 2 different completion techniques, perf and plug and ball drop, and just what better way to compare the 2 techniques than have wells side by side. So that was one of the main things. And to that end, at the first pad, we did microseismic, did a pretty comprehensive tracer survey, and that kind of helped us understand as we went here. Now, obviously, the main reason for doing these big cubes is parent-child interference, and you know, that's where I think we want to get to, and I think probably the whole industry wants to get to, trying to reduce any parent-child results there. And you know, I think that's the best way you can do it, is just do as big a cubes as you can, because you are seeing interference between different layers in some cases, and you know, so you can't just assume you can go do one layer and then come back a few years later and do a layer below it or above it. So, you know, what we're set out to do here was try to learn as much as we could, and I think it'll serve us well, you know, in Inga fireweed and Wembley pipestone as well, and then in oak.
You mentioned that you tried, you know, ball drop, plug and perf. Have you settled on what you prefer, whether it's an economic perspective or results?
Not really. It's pretty, you know, it seems like in Inga fireweed it was a bit zone specific, so it seemed like we're getting better results from ball drop in the upper zone, getting some really fantastic upper wells, and the middle and the IBZ seem to be react better to plug and perf.
Okay.
So we're going to do a bit more experimenting. Like in oak, we're doing the same thing. We've got some ball drops and some plug and perf planned, and you know, we'll start doing the same thing at Wembley.
Sounds good. Pat, turn to you for a second, for a few minutes there. Painted Pony, you know, you're a sizable producer in Northeast BC. You know, I've been following you for a long time. A few years ago, you went into a manufacturing type process with some, you know, some pretty big growth targets, which obviously have materialized. You know, what are your thoughts on cube development? You know, I don't see that you're as aggressive from a cube development perspective as some of your peers. Maybe can you talk a little bit about that, and maybe in the future how cubes could fit into your strategy?
Sure. Well, we've been drilling on our property for over 10 years now, and we're up over 200 wells drilled to date. We spent the early years trying to figure out best designs and best completion practices. Those things are always evolving, but and we continue to do that. As far as the cubes, what we found that we kind of talk about upper, middle, lower, but there's really subzones in there. There's about 7 layers that we see to develop when the area is fully developed. Our zone averages over 330 meters thick. We've drilled most of our wells into the upper and the lower. I think we've got over a dozen in the middle, what we call the middle zone. We focused on where we're getting the best deliverability. The main thing on the cube development we find, and I think both Dave and Jeff had alluded to this, is that the cost efficiencies of moving a rig in and drilling well, at least 4 wells in a row on a pad, and 6 or higher would even be better. The most we've done at once like that was 6. We've got a 7-well pad we're looking at drilling later this year. The bank's willing and cash flow willing. The efficiency and time, I think Jeff alluded to time and how they drop their time on drilling and time on fracking, and I think that's a big thing. I think the industry always knew we dropped time. Time was money when it came to drilling, but time is money on fracking as well. So a day saved on fracking saves you about $400,000. The other thing is spacing. So when you talk about cubes, and we've looked at cube development across the Canadian basin, but one of our directors is a professor at Texas A&M, and he does a lot of studies and gives lots of information on cube development down in the Permian, etc., and some of the issues. the first thing is it takes a lot of capital to be able to drill, 14 wells at a time, or 12 even, and then frack them before you see any of that production. So with the restrictions on cash flow and that, we haven't been able to go to a larger programs. We've been picking pads to go back onto and developing those. The offset between wells is very important. We've spent a lot of time studying that. We've determined in our area 300-meter interwell spacing is probably as close as you want to go. And on a vertical sense, probably we're mostly 100 meters apart, but we think 35 you're probably still safe. The other thing we do is when we're, even on our wells that we're 300 meters apart, we chevron them, so we're going maybe 10 or 15 meters, even 20 meters difference in depth in particular zones, just so that we don't get the frac interference. And we find that our 300 meters and our chevroning, we're getting limited frac hits on the offset wells. We shut in any produced wells, offsetting us as we frac. Certainly as you deplete a zone and you go back into frac, the well offsetting, fracs love to go from the highest pressure to the lowest pressure. So if you've got a pressure sink next to you, i.e. a producing well, that's where the frac will tend to try to drive towards. So just it's looking back, and we're constantly studying our well performance, all the well performance offsetting us. Tourmaline's right next to us now, and they're drilling a bunch of wells. Shell had been in there, Petronas. So we were always watching what people are doing offsetting us and making sure that we're being as efficient as possible.
So in a normalized cash flow environment, as you kind of alluded to, would your development be a lot more geared towards cube development, given that I think you said 7 layers or 7 different intervals that you could look at in the 350 meters across your land base? Again, absent any capital constraints, have you come to the conclusion that cube development is the way to go, or is there more to be said there?
Yeah, I think we'd probably go in and drill capital wise. We'd probably like to go in and drill eight wells at a time. That's probably the efficiency peak that we think we would see on a pad. Whether you drill them all in the upper zone, drilling 4 north and 4 south or something, or whether we go 4 in the upper, 4 in the middle, or 4 in the upper and the lower. So there's lots of different patterns. I don't, from what we have heard about some of the catastrophic failures in the U.S. with guys going in and drilling and spending $250 million drilling 1 cube development and having production come in 50% below their expectations after the fact is a gamble that I can't see us at Painted Pony ever getting to. So I think there's certainly an approach to it. Offsetting the wells, making sure there's no hits, again, is very important, or limited hits, and that you're not interfering. And we learned about 4 years ago, we went into South Townsend and drilled a multi-well approach there, 4 wells, horizontals side by side, but we decided to downspace, and they were in the neighborhood of just over 200-meter interwell spacing, I think about 250 on average, and that was a disaster for us. We didn't get the results we've seen since then or before then on doing that, so we learned a hard lesson that keeping that spacing was very important. And so again, if you go into a cube, you better have your science down. And I heard Jeff refer to that. That's very important, is to make sure your science and you know that offset distance both vertically and horizontally you're protected. Another thing to watch for is fractures and fracture directions, faults. We offset our faults, and we have 3D seismic that we drill all our wells on. So those are the things that we keep looking at, and haven't had a disaster like we had in Townsend for before or since then. So.
Yep, and hopefully no more in the future. I assume disaster is kind of an extreme word there. I mean, you learned a lot from it, I'm sure. Jonathan, I'll switch to New Vista a bit. In Pipestone, and particularly Pipestone South, there's a 8-well Montney cube that you've slowly started to announce results from. As far as I'm aware, and maybe some of the other panelists may disagree, but as far as I'm aware, that's the only cube on this panel that spans 4 different intervals. Can you talk to us a little bit about the background, how you went straight to a 4-layer cube at Pipestone like this? And as a follow-on to that, now that it is on production, what are the conclusions? What are some of the implications for the rest of Pipestone, and even some of the other assets at Wapiti, and what you would do differently, if anything?
Yeah, sounds good, JJ, and thanks for having us too. So kind of similar to some of the themes we've heard, in the earlier days there weren't a lot of wells in the area for us or for competitors, and so since then every zone across our area has been proven productive to different levels and different condensate ratios, and so different economics. But at the time, 9 years ago when we started, it wasn't even sure whether some of these zones would be able to produce high amounts of gas because they're quite condensate laden, which is valuable, but tougher to flow through the tight rock. So, you weren't going to park a huge amount of money on a multi-layer cube when you weren't even sure what a single zone was going to do. And so that's why in Bilbo and Elmworth in the early days, we were doing single zone wells and just 1 or 2 or 3 at a time. Once the knowledge got developed, we're over 200 wells in the area now ourselves, and our competitors added with ourselves takes it well over, I think it's 12 or 1,400 wells now. So there's a huge amount of knowledge, and across every zone there's been a large amount of proof. And so that was the primary reason why 9 years ago you saw us doing singles in single zone and then moving to doubles and triples in terms of pads. And now more recently, yes, we did do an 8-well cube in Pipestone South, which I'll get into here. We did a 6-well cube in Pipestone South since then, based on continuing the learnings, and we've done a 12-well cube up at Pipestone North, which is yet to be fracked but has been drilled. So the primary reason is because on our own lands and on the lands directly surrounding us, there was proven production across all 4 of those zones. So that's from bottom up. That's the lower Montney, also called the A, and then the middle Montney, B, C, and D as you head upwards. And the D doesn't even exist south of the river at, say, Bilbo and the southern areas, but up at Pipestone South and North it does exist. Mother Nature did not erode it away. So to cut a long story short, that's why we were confident, is we built our way up from 1s to 2s to 3s to a bunch of 4s. We did a 5 and a 6-well pad. Now I've done an 8, and next step is a 12-well pad. Every time we did that, we learned more. We did some science and tech pads as well, the most recent one being at Pipestone South, where we did microseismic, fiber optic, and a whole bunch of other technical data to integrate. And of course now I've got decline analysis, and we're able to watch the interference. So we're very comfortable with the spacing and the kind of efficiency of frac that we've been getting on the smaller pads, and that's why we were comfortable taking it up to a higher level. And just to give you an idea of the kind of efficiencies, it's also cheaper to drill north of the river in our Pipestone South and North properties. And so we've got our costs down on the 12-well pad 45% cheaper per horizontal meter just for the drilling, because we haven't fracked it yet, as compared to our entire average of all our wells just last year in 2019. And of course each year has gotten cheaper than the year before. So very happy with that. And then in terms of the progression, we have moved up to the 12-well pad up at Pipestone North now, and so it's really just a question of continuing these learnings, continuing to get the data, and continuing to drive the cost downwards. And I'll just quickly say on well spacing, we heard some comments on well spacing there. I would agree, like we've kind of found that in our area with our type of rock, kind of in that 250, sometimes 300 meter interwell spacing is kind of an ideal number if you want to get the maximum recovery per well and get the maximum resource recovery as well. So you're maximizing your rate of return but not leaving much resource behind. And the only thing we do is we maybe add 50 to 100 meters to that when you're near a parent well. So if you're doing a pad near an old pad, then we increase the spacing so you get beyond kind of the event horizon where the other pad will feel the pad that you're drilling.
I guess that's kind of a sacrificial, you sacrifice a few locations for the sake of improving productivity rates from the 2 pads, I assume, right?
Yeah, it's all about maximizing rate of return. And so if you go too close, as Pat indicated, you'll start getting some loss of your frac fluid and pressure over to the other well. That existing well will have trouble producing for a while until it produces back the water, and you won't get the same efficiency on your frac. So it's all about getting the best rate of return on those wells and on the capital that you're spending. So you're not leaving a ton of resources behind, but you are optimizing your rate of return.
Mike, let's turn to Advantage here next. For those not familiar, I mean, Advantage is Glacier asset is gas weighted, but over the last few years, Advantage has shown some real good progress generating liquids from some of the middle zones at Glacier, but also going into some of the more liquids rich and oilier areas of Progress in Wembley and Alberta. I wanted to touch a little bit because it's kind of unique. How has the cube development and spacing and completions, how has that changed as you've transitioned from, a leaner gas resource into one that's oily or much more liquids rich? Is there a significant change in the way you approach cube development and design? And if so, how do you see that transitioning in the future?
Sure thing. Sure. So first off, thanks for having me on this panel. And it's great to share the virtual podium with Jeff, Jonathan, Pat, and Dave. Glad to be here. And JJ, I have to also say a shout out for the hard work you and the team have been doing on the details of the Montney and the liquid-rich Montney in particular. It seems like in the hustle and bustle of this crazy world we live in, it's pretty rare to see people dig in to understand the differences. So thank you for the hard work. So as it stands for Advantage, we now do have a rich history of drilling in the Montney. We've got more than a decade of development, and we started in the west of our assets, and we started adding land over probably a period of 5 years to the east. And not surprisingly, as you go west towards the east, it gets richer. So we go, over time, we went from Glacier, which is leaner, to some condensate rich in the middle Montney. Then you go to Valhalla, which is rich gas with some condensate, and then you go to Progress and Wembley, where we've got light oil, basically, with still decently high gas rates accompanying that. So we're starting in the Glacier area, which really was one of the earlier areas to develop in the Montney. Very high quality gassy rock, pretty hard to screw it up. And at the time, early on, even 2008, it was very common to start with poly CO2 and low tonnage, low rate fracs. As time went on, it became apparent that slick water is better, a little more tonnage is better, but really, in general, it worked. No matter what you did, worked. Cemented, packers, you name it. And then we moved to a pentastack, what we used to call pentastack. So actually, to catch something, you made the comment about a 4-layer cube. We've actually done a 5-layer cube about 4 years ago. That was the so the lower, so what we call layer 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 5 layers in a row. It'd be kind of the D1, D2, D3, D4, and upper would be the terminology be commonly used by scientists in the area. So we did a pentastack in Glacier. We did it all with packers. Tonnage was not high. It was kind of a 0.4 to 0.7 tons per meter on each one of those wells. Slightly higher in the middle where the rock is tighter. And this has always worked. It's always worked fairly well because high quality rock put together with gas, it all flows fairly well. As you move further east, and especially as we got into Wembley and Progress, and JJ, this is something you pointed out probably a year ago, which is, hey, you're not going to apply the same frac design, are you? And you were correct. We've had the benefit of watching many of our competitors pump liquids-style fracs into the area. That evolution has been happening in Wembley for 5 years at least. And we did shift to a much more liquid-style frac, which, out of necessity to keep, and Jonathan, you touched on this, the nature of the liquids in the rock. Bigger molecules, tighter pore spaces don't flow. You have to have a much more complex fracture network. So we've gone to what people are typically using in the area, and nothing special. In fact, we're probably on the conservative side, but we still have gone to tighter frac spacing, 12 meter to 18 meter interperf spacing, and roughly 2 tons per meter. And that change really, I think we were probably the last ones to make the change because we're the last ones to be drilling oil in the area. We've been waiting for de-risking to happen before we jumped in kind of foot first. So long and short of it, huge change from Packer's low intensity pentastack, and now we're really just doing one interval in each of Wembley and Progress at a time to make sure we have our technology down pat before we start to get active on cubes.
Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks for the compliments. Appreciate that. You touched on a report that we did publish, and recently, and I think one of the big conclusions was exactly that. And we looked specifically at Pipestone, but I assume it applies elsewhere in the Montney, where we looked at multi-layer cubes and we quantified parent-child interference, and basically concluded that one, it's measurable, but two, it has a pretty big impact on, could have a pretty big impact on reserves and development plans. I know there's been an issue outside of the Montney too, south of the border, certainly at the Permian, and I think Pat, you touched on that Dominator pad that had a lot of challenges. I guess what I wanted to do here is ask each one of you, and Mike, I'll start with you. What steps are you taking to mitigate some of these parent-child interference? I know you, Mike, you said we're only going to try a few different layers at a time and watch what some of our competitors are doing. But one, how material is parent-child issues? What steps are you taking to mitigate this issue? And is it a serious or a significant issue, as we're reading about across the industry? Is it something investors should be really concerned with, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, so thanks for starting with me this time. So we see it as being a huge issue, and we've done really in-depth study of other people's work, of other people's investments, and I always say the best way to learn from mistakes is to learn from other people's mistakes, not your own. So we've been able to do that, being a slow mover in the Wembley area in particular. So certainly we see parent-child interference is just a complicated or perhaps easier way of saying failures. When you have a well that comes on at half the rate of the next door well, that was the design problem. And so broadly speaking, the aggressive approach to developing any resource is often pushed by a couple of different factors. One of the factors could be that you paid a huge amount of money for the land, you got to eke as much resource out as possible. Another factor could be simply an inventory situation where in order to make sure your company can continue to grow for long enough on the resource that you've captured, you really have to squeeze a lot of wells into a smaller amount of land. So we think of the cube as being something to be very carefully used, and frankly, at a time like this, a COVID type time, and whatever follows, it seems like there will be plenty of land, and there will be plenty of resource, and we think most likely that it'll be capital that is the rare commodity. And as a result, we're not inclined to try and jam tightly stacked and tightly spaced laterally wells into our tracts of land. We've, in our situation, being a smaller producer, 45,000 BOEs a day, we actually don't have a limit on how many wells we need to jam into our assets. We have about 120 sections of liquid-rich lands on top of the 80 at Glacier. So with the size we're at and with the scarcity of capital, we're inclined to jealously guard each dollar and make sure that we don't have sort of interwell interference, parent-child interference, degradation of follow-up wells. Whatever way you put it, for us, it's got to be a conservative approach, and that goes back to really a fundamental kind of characteristic advantage is that we're always going to be a little bit conservative with the way we go after it, and whether it's shrinking the tons per meter or tightening up the spacing, trying to keep all the sand as close to wellbore as possible, we're unlikely to be jamming wells together and pushing the limits on parent-child.
So, kind of to summarize what you just said, in your view, for a company of Advantage's size, and I'll ask the other guys the same question, but a company of Advantage's size, the trade-off between, the capital concentration risk, I guess, is it's more important to focus on that than to focus on maximizing inventory. Like you'd be more than willing to sacrifice some future inventory at some point in order to make sure that, you're not taking as much risk on the capital side up front. Is that fair?
Yeah, That's really well put. In fact, I probably could even oversimplify it by saying we'd rather leave a few percent resource in the ground than have a few percent of interference or parent-child degradation. And that's what we're currently using as our design parameter.
So, Jonathan, what's your stance or NuVista's stance on that issue or that trade-off?
Yeah, JJ, I think Mike worded that really well. Like, balance sheet is king right now, and rate of return is always king. So I'll just add by exception, a couple of things. One is spacing, very important, and you've heard from several of us and Mike about that. But the other thing is zonal isolation. Like, one of the things we can learn from these science and tech pads and the ongoing production from the wells is some zones, when you put wells into multi-zones, the fracs will travel across the zone and communicate with the other zone more readily than in others because of seal layers in between that may or may not be as effective. So once you learn more about that, that tells you a lot more. So spacing isn't just in the XY direction. It's also, you could look at the depth side of it as well and say, well, let's put more wells in the XY but less wells in the vertical because I think we can access two zones with one well. So that's for sure a factor. The other thing I just want to point out is there is a price relationship here. I'll just give you a simple example. Like, for example, we know for our wells in our area, the CGR increases as you move up through the zones and upwards. And different zones have different levels of productivity, and so you can try and optimize your economics from all of that. But I will just posit that if you take, say, a 4-zone stack and you look at a high price regime where prices are very good, you might be looking at 70 to 100% rates of return because they are going to vary across the different wells once you've figured out which different zones do what. But if you take that same cube and you put it into a low price scenario, you might be looking at 20 to 50% rates of return. And so I would argue that in the first case, you're going to want to probably do that whole cube because you can get great economics and get it all. However, Mike's quite right. We all are pretty rich with inventory here. We got a lot of very positive economics land with a large amount of inventory. So in a low price scenario, you don't want to drill any 20% type wells. You want to high grade to those 40 and 50% wells in a very low price environment so that you can protect your balance sheet, drill at a slower pace until things get better, and you're not worried about leaving a little bit of resource behind. So that's definitely a factor that needs to be looked at as well. So it always comes back to returns and making sure that you do enough science to figure out what is the optimal spacing, cluster efficiency, sand and water content, and even types.
So maybe I'll take that a step further and move over to you, Dave. With inventory, I guess the comments that Mike and Jonathan made, and I'll let you agree or disagree, with inventory, being a trade-off, we don't need to develop everything. We've got lots of land and lots of inventory. How does that impact potential buyers? I mean, will a buyer come and look at an asset and say, well, we like what you did, but you sterilized a bunch of locations, so maybe I'm not going to pay you as much. So, I mean, is that a risk? Is that a significant risk?
Yeah, I think the way we've kind of looked at it and the way we've went about our business is, we've got fairly large tracts of land that are we're not proven up. So I think the first thing that we felt we had to do was delineate the land block and understand the CGRs, the productivity, and exactly what we had there. And once you get to that point, and if you can get to that point without doing a lot of delineation wells, and in this type of play, it's not like you got to have a well every 2 or 3 miles. You can understand a lot about the play, jumping 4 or 5 miles at a time, and that's kind of what we did, kind of in all our areas, or are doing. And then when it comes down, when you've got it delineated, the way we look at it is you go in there and develop on a cube basis, just for the very reason of parent-child interference. And if you don't do that, it's just, if you come back 3 or 4 years later and say, geez, I'm going to drill this layer that's 50 or 30 or 50 meters below what I've completed here 3 or 4 years ago, yeah, I think you're in for a lot of trouble in most cases. Now, in some cases, just like Jonathan said, you do have some good barriers that make that so it's not as big of a problem. We found that in Inga fireweed, the upper Montney seemed to be separated from the IBZ and middle quite well. So I think you know, there is specific cases where you could go in there and develop, you know, one layer, but I think the ideal way is to do it in some sort of cube fashion, so you're not sterilizing so much land.
I'll thank you very much for that. I'll switch gears a little bit. I want to touch, because we only have 4 minutes here. I want to touch a little bit, talk a little bit about cost structure. Obviously, with margins being as compressed as they have been lately, and you know, a lot of the liquids contribution, you know, becoming not as it used to be, or certainly not as budgeted. And maybe I'll start with you, Pat, Painted Pony. What steps have you taken from an operating perspective, operating costs, transportation costs, to, you know, reduce some of these costs? What order of magnitude are we talking about? And do you think we could see, you know, how does cube development fit into that from a cost structure? And I'm not talking capital costs, I'm just talking operating and transportation costs.
Yeah, well, I mean, cost is absolutely critical these days. I think one of the things we've been experimenting with is the longer laterals, and initially we'd kind of played with those years past, but we made a more concerted effort, and we found that a longer lateral gets us, so we go 50% longer, we get 40% more production. It costs us 15 to 20% more capital. So that's probably been our biggest breakthrough recently on you know, what we can do to cut costs. And as far as you know, dealing with the pipeline guys, they overcharge for everything, but and they keep creeping up their costs. We've been hounding them about that. We've been pushing on our midstream guys, and we did. I think you saw not too long ago we dropped some of our costs at the main AltaGas plant that we produce to. Getting some other people into that plant is going to help with some costs as well, and we're seeing more of that these days.
Has there been flexibility on the midstream front? Sorry to interrupt you. Has there been flexibility, have you found, on the midstream front to accommodate, you know, the changing times, so to speak, or have they been pretty rigid?
You know, there's there's only so much they'll give. Yeah, we've had some breakthroughs, I'd say that way, but nothing dramatic. I think that I'll quote some the other guys in the industry have said, you know, the midstreamers are just taking too much of the rent these days as our prices has been compressed. And so how do we change that? That's a really good question, but especially the pipeline guys, where they're a monopoly, they're regulated, but they've managed to get the regulator to allow costs to continue to creep up, and when meanwhile our price for a commodity keeps dropping. So it's a struggle for everybody, I think, and you know, we have to keep chipping away and maybe come up with some innovative ways to, that's the way the Alliance pipeline got built, is increased competition for capacity. So yeah, it's an important part of our problem. Yeah.
So I was just going to say.
Go ahead, JJ.
I was going to say, Jonathan, you know, any strides, because you've got some, you know, third-party volumes and commitments. Any willingness on the midstreamers front to negotiate and be more flexible in this environment? How would you address that?
Yeah, JJ, I would say they are showing flexibility. I mean, I think they recognize that it's a very different world right now, and you know, the double black swan event, I guess, of the Saudi-Russian oil war and the COVID-19 thing is an assault on the entire industry, certainly a North American one, and I think they recognize that. So so definitely our conversations are going well, you know, and I think there's always ways to make those a win-win. You know, for example, take contracts and reduce the take-or-pay requirement. That's something we're working on. You do that in the short term, but you can maybe extend term in some cases and end up with a win-win there. So there's various ways to do it, but definitely I would say our midstreamers are being constructive, and we appreciate that very much. You know, on the other cost front, you know, we've dropped our G&A 20 to 25% this year versus our budget, and 15% per BOE versus last year. And we've dropped our OPEX as well, despite having restricted our production to save it for a better day. And when you do that, you can keep your cost per BOE flat. So, you know, staying away from the capital cost discussion, you know, we work pretty hard on the OPEX and the G&A side as well. And that's why, you know, we're able to sort of continue here with a stay flat plan for 2 years if we need to, while still paying down debt.
Well, that's great, and I'm looking at time here. We're over by a minute. Thank you very much for your time. Really, really appreciate the discussion. As a reminder for anybody else that's on the line here, if anything did not get addressed, you know how to find us, get a hold of us, and we'll make sure to address that. So thanks for your time. Have a great afternoon, and we'll chat soon.
Thanks, JJ.